Hey guys, and welcome to a very long and comprehensive summary of 4 chapters of Book 2. The reason why we're doing it this way is because I want to make sure that the section that I present to you today lines up with the section provided in the textbook, so that way people who prefer the textbook have the same information and knowledge that you have and are up to date. So what are we going to achieve today? Well, we're going to explore a comprehensive section of Book 2 that outlines how ethical behavior is shaped by pleasure and pain, and more importantly, so I didn't write it here because I wanted to be brief, how ethical behavior is shaped by our responses to pleasure and pain, or shaped by how we are taught to respond to pleasure and pain. That idea of how we are taught to respond to pleasure and pain really does help us understand how one engages in what is right or wrong. Okay? Then logically following from that virtuous behavior, well, we need to look at virtuous behavior and how it relates to our responses to pleasure and pain. And then once we've looked at that, how do we become virtuous? They're the three things we're trying to look at. So as usual, we're going to name and define and interrelate key terms. We're going to outline Aristotle's suggested relationship between ethical behavior and pleasure and pain, as we mentioned up there. We need to look at the relationship between virtuous action, what we do as virtuous people, and how that's related to our responses to pleasure and pain. And then we need to explore how we can become virtuous. What do we need to do to be a virtuous person? So I want you to just go through all these, please. Score yourself 1 to 4 on each success criteria. And once you've done that, can you draw a picture of your favorite superhero? And while you're doing that, just have a think about what it is that makes your superhero super. What makes them the good guy? Alright, so let's try and be as quick as possible. Chapter 1 starts off with an outline of 2 different types of virtue. We've got moral virtue and we have intellectual virtue. Now, intellectual virtue is cultivated and made through education primarily. And this makes sense because we think that mainly of virtue as doing good things these days, or having the state of somebody that wants to do good things. Internal dispositions to do good would be a better way of describing virtue today. But in ancient Greek times, it was more about excellence. Remember before we talked about virtue being the capacity to apply reason to the way we behave and to do it well. And reason is a unique human function, and the ultimate or the good of a function resides in the function. So, the good lute player plays the lute well. Well, likewise, the good human being is able to reason well because reason is a function they have. So you can understand then that how intellectual virtue, if virtue means excellence, makes sense. And then we can take on board this moral excellence. And he believes moral virtue or moral excellence isn't cultivated through education, it's done through habits and through actions. It's habit that allows us to grow, and we need to not perform bad habits, we need good habits. He then argues that, I should actually give you some time to take a note. He then argues that we all have the capacity to be virtuous, both morally and intellectually. We have the potential, but we need the training in order to become properly virtuous. Just like a lute player plays the lute well through training, and a builder builds really good homes through learning and developing the experience they need. Their functions are improved through experience, or they're able to achieve the ultimate good that their functions suggest through their experience. Well, we need to do the same. To grow our virtue, we need to engage in habits and train and perform actions that allow us to build up that experience and become virtuous. Okay, take a note. He then goes on to say that virtue can be produced or made or destroyed through whatever actions we perform. Obviously, bad actions or actions that don't have virtue would destroy our internal state of virtue. But things that are virtuous actions would build our state of virtue, right? And we need to then perform good habits in order to become virtuous. We need to have good habits to be virtuous. Take a note. So if we look at what would be a bad habit in relation to our self-restraint, which we're going to call temperance, being self-indulgent would obviously be a bad behavior that would obviously destroy our internal state of virtue. But being good-tempered, not goof-tempered, good-tempered, which means, you know, really thinking about what will produce you with pleasure and experiencing some kind of content, pleasure, and restraining yourself would lead to a good habit. And those good habits would then allow you to acquire a state of virtue. Okay? That's just an example. So, good or bad behavior shapes our virtue, right? And states of character, this should probably be written down, arise from our actions. Take a note. So, good states of character are acquired through performing good actions, which can easily be done if we acquire good habits. Bad states of character, well, obviously the opposite applies. And the key is if you really want to be a virtuous person, and in turn that'll lead to happiness, because remember, virtue is the application of reason to life. Virtue means excellence, and being excellent at being a human being means applying reason to life in a way that is pretty good. Well, you need to actually start applying this to, you need to start learning these good habits when you're very young. And that's where we finish off in chapter 1. Take a note. Now, Aristotle's again cautions us and he says, look, it's about precision here. I mean, the circumstances through which we are expected to practice good habits, they vary. And they're not really easy to pinpoint. And therefore, because we don't have a few, we've got many different circumstances through which we're expected to perform good actions. It's very hard to come up with a fixed set of rules or prescribed morals that tell us how to be good. But he can come up with something. So he starts looking at these particular areas. He looks at our health, and then he looks at our strength, and then he looks at the virtues of courage and the virtues of temperance, which means self-restraint. Take a note. And from an analysis of these areas, what he basically argues is that virtue is destroyed by vice. And vice are bad actions and bad habits. And it's also a tendency or a disposition to do bad things, right? And these vices can be divided into two characters. You can have a vice where you have too much of something, or you can have a vice where you have too little. And the vice of too much is called the vice of excess, and the vice of too little is the vice of defect or deficiency. So you probably should take a note. Vices, which are actions, destroy virtue. You can have vices of defect or vices of excess. Take a note. Then he gets into what we've all learnt about Aristotle, we learnt last year. Basically, the way that we preserve our virtue is through the middle point, where we don't engage in a behavior in such an excessive way, or we don't behave in a behavior that is so restricted or too little. We need to come up with the ultimate middle point where our behavior is just right, not too excessive and not too deficient. Right? Take a note. So that would mean that I don't overly self-restrain myself to the point of living like an ascetic monk. I am allowed to experience some pleasure, but I don't engage in every single pleasure that I think would be great, because that would overdo it, right? I need to find a golden mean where I cultivate and I have the right amount of pleasure, and that would be called temperance, the virtue of temperance, where I have just the right point, okay? And the key thing to remember is that sometimes where the virtue sits isn't always in the middle. Like in some areas of bravery, where he talks about rashness as the virtue of excess versus the vice of excess, and he talks about the vice of deficiency as cowardice. The actual point of bravery might be a little bit further to rashness. And that's something to consider. The actual golden mean, or the middle point, which tells us what the virtue is, isn't always in the middle, though in this picture it is. All right. this picture was here. Originally, I downloaded this picture to give you a simple point, but sometimes the golden mean can actually shift in different directions depending on whether or not the vice of excess or vice of deficiency is less destructive. Okay, take a note. Now, what's really important is that actualization or making virtue in yourself, the sphere of actualization that where we occur, is activity. You can't become virtuous. You can't acquire this internal state of virtue without performing actions that are virtuous, which means you must acquire good behaviors. So this little phrase of the sphere of actualization of virtue just means bringing your virtue into being, making it. And what actually makes it actual is our behavior, and our good habits cultivate virtue. All right, take a note. So this means that our actions can even can shape our virtue, or they can destroy it. Obviously, the vices would destroy, and cultivating behaviors and habits that relate to the golden means between those virtues would then basically encourage the development of virtue. So, for instance, practicing self-restraint would make you a temperate person, and being more temperate makes it easier to practice self-restraint because a virtuous man is able to more easily engage in acts of virtue. So it's like a cycle. Our virtue is grown and developed through practicing states of virtue or practicing actions of virtue. But as we do that, we acquire the internal state of virtue, which then makes it easier to perform actions of virtue. Take a note. So in chapter 3, Aristotle tries to do a bit of an analysis of this, and he talks about, well, then how does this relate to the way we respond to our own internal feelings? And one of those feelings is pleasure. Okay. Now, you may find that, or he actually argues, finding pleasure in the act of doing something noble is a prerequisite for virtue. Okay. He says it can only be a virtuous act if you find pleasure in performing the virtuous act. You don't just do it for the sake of getting brownie points. You need to enjoy it and understand that it is a good thing to do. And this relates again to that function. If you believe virtue means excellence, as the ancient Greeks did, and moral virtue would mean moral excellence, as the ancient Greeks did, then you would quickly say, okay, well, then it logically applies that being a human being requires me to be excellent at my unique function, which is the performance of reason, and moral virtue is an application of reason to the way that I perform. So therefore, I must actually engage in that particular behavior of moral virtue, because that's basically what reason is telling me to do. I must do this, I must perform this virtuous behavior really well. And because it's my internal human function, I will find joy in doing it because it is basically what I am supposed to do. All right. So moral virtue, he says, is related to pleasure, finding some sort of pleasure in moral acts, but it also relates to the way we respond to pain. Take a note. And he kind of says, after looking at that example of, basically after of discussing the fact that it's a prerequisite for virtuous actions to be pleasurable to those that are virtuous, he kind of says that all virtues are related to our activities and our passions, and all activities and passions are motivated by our pleasures and pains that we receive from them. Take a note. And this is from a basic kind of almost behaviorist principle, way before, like 2,000 years before behaviorism was invented. He says, look, there's a tendency for us to want to avoid actions that cause us pain, and there's a tendency for us to want to pursue actions that cause us pleasure, right? So we may do the wrong thing because it causes us pleasure, and we may want to avoid doing the right thing because it'll cause us pain. And the point then he goes on to argue is that, well, actually, we should create a society where children are educated to respond properly to pleasure and pain, to make sure that we do what we should do in the face of situations that cause us pleasure and pain. So it's not about pleasure and pain being the goal, okay? It's about, and maybe I don't think that this is really implied yet, but I mean, that makes sense if you understand Aristotle. Happiness results in being the excellent human being, and happiness therefore results in the excellent application of reason to our moral character, which therefore means that the ultimate good and the ultimate happiness that we can achieve is through being virtuous and doing good things. It's not about pursuing pleasure for pleasure's sake. So that makes sense. For him, pleasure and pain are not the end game, but we do behave, or we are conditioned to behave in certain ways that make us avoid pain, and we do behave in ways that make us want to pursue pleasure. And the key thing is to get us to behave in a virtuous way in the face of pleasure and pain. So that's the goal, right? It's not to pursue pleasure and pain, it's to perform in a virtuous way in the face of situations that cause pleasure and pain, because then we will be performing our own function really well, which is the capacity to reason, and the application of reason to moral behavior or moral excellence is virtue. Okay? Take a note. So therefore he goes on to say, look, what you should behave in a way that you should be, because, if what makes a man bad is the way that he responds to pleasure and pain, then virtue must be doing what is right with respect to pleasure and pain. Okay? Take a note. This is further elaborated on when he starts exploring objects of choice, which are good things. People would want to choose things that are pleasant, noble, or provide you with some kind of advantage. And then there are objects of avoidance. People want to avoid the most base and disgusting things. Base means low, like really, really low. If I say base, it's morally bankrupt, it's poor. We also want to avoid things that cause us injury or things that are painful. And he says, look, what happens is a good man tends to do the right thing when confronted with these scenarios, right? And he tends to, respond properly to pain to do the good, and properly to pleasure to do the good. Whereas a bad man, he does the wrong thing when faced with objects of choice or objects of pleasure. He'll pursue pleasure, even if it means doing the wrong thing, and he'll avoid pain, even if it means doing the wrong thing. Which goes against the function of the human being, because reason would imply that you do the right thing no matter what, even if it is painful. Okay? And remember, the application of reason to moral life is virtue, according to Aristotle. Okay, take a note. So it's how they react to situations, and he believes that this is strongest with pleasure. The way that we react to pleasure is the most important thing that we should focus on, because we as infants were trained to seek pleasure whenever we can. All right. So we must teach children since their infants to respond properly to scenarios of pleasure and pain, and to do right in the face of pleasure and pain, because sometimes the pursuit of pleasure and pain can contradict contradict our ability to perform our function well. Remember, goodness resides in function. If goodness resides in function, and the human being's function is to reason, it logically follows that we should be reasoning well, and we will find the chief good in reasoning well, because it is our unique function, and all goods or doing something well want to aspire to the chief function, and happiness is the chief function. If we perform our chief function or our unique function well, we will achieve the chief good. But sometimes that function, or what we reason is virtuous behavior, contradicts what will give us pleasure and pain, and we need to teach people how to do the right thing in the face of pleasure and pain. Okay, take a note. In particular, take a note about the fact that reason and virtue can conflict with what is painful and pleasurable. Okay, so chapter 4 then talks about action, and we basically say that it's through our actions that we mold our internal state of character. Pretty easy. Virtue is the output of actions, right? And most people will then say that you can only therefore be virtuous when you are performing the action that is virtuous, which is a bit of a problem, because then you can't have an internal virtuous state. You can only be virtuous when you are acting virtuously, because, of course, virtue is the output of good actions or virtuous actions. It's not a fixed internal state, some people can argue. It's only virtuous when engaged in virtuous activity. And that means virtuous actions are a little false. That's what he's worried about. Take a note. He then goes on to argue that he doesn't believe this. He doesn't believe it. There needs to be something more. You can blindly carry out a virtuous action and it's not actually virtuous. The behavior may appear to be virtuous, but it's not a true virtuous action. All right? Virtuous actions are not necessarily virtuous. They must be conducted by a person who chooses to engage in the activity because they know that it is virtuous. They choose the action for its own particular sake, and it comes from a character or a personality who is of virtuous character. And the way that he says it is, they proceed from a firm and unchangeable character, which means from a virtuous character. So therefore, just being temperate, because you're following the logic that this will make you virtuous, won't work. You almost have to be like a noble Superman. The virtuous action needs to be performed by someone who wishes to be virtuous or is virtuous in order for it to be a virtuous act. Otherwise, it's just pure naked self-interest. And if you do that, you can't actually be virtuous. You're not doing it for the right moral sake. Take a note. At the end of chapter 4, the conclusion is that most people don't perform virtuous actions in the state of being virtuous. Right? They only act based on the theory, not based on the spirit. And if you do that, you can never really improve yourself as a virtuous being. You can't add to your virtue. In order for one to add to their virtuous state, they must engage in behavior that is virtuous while they are in the mental state of being a virtuous person. Take a note. Okay, so now when we look at our success criteria, we know that we've come up with a lot of names and different definitions, and we've interrelated premises basically to come up with conclusions. We have looked at the relationship between the importance of our ethical behavior and its response to pleasure and pain. Basically, we are conditioned to behave according to pleasure and pain since birth. And it's not necessarily that pleasurable behaviors are ethical and painful behaviors are bad. That's completely wrong. It totally disagrees with Callicles in that respect. More importantly, ethical behavior is doing what is right or wrong in the face of pleasure or pain. Right? We do what is virtuous, which is ethical, even if it may cause us pain, or even if it takes away our pleasure. We could also do what is ethical, even if it causes pleasure and helps us avoid pain. But it's about our responses to pleasure and pain that may take us away from or lead us to pleasure and pain. And that really, hopefully you got that. Hopefully you understand that, and that's in your notes. The second thing is that virtuous behavior is, again, like I said up here, it's about our responses to pleasure and pain. And we should be teaching our children to respond appropriately, because sometimes what is the good thing to do, which will make us eudaimonically happy, because being eudaimonically happy is about achieving the chief good, and achieving the chief good is all about achieving our good, and our good is about reasoning well, and reasoning well is a unique human function, and the application of reason to life is virtuous, or a pursuit of excellence. So if you follow all that logic, it's quite easy to see that virtue or reason can easily conflict with what will be pleasurable, or it could even be painful. All right? So it's about teaching children how to respond to scenarios that cause pleasure and pain. And how do we become virtuous? It's not just enough to perform virtuous actions. One must engage in a virtuous behavior if they wish to become virtuous or if they already are. Otherwise, you don't get any self-betterment or self-improvement. You just function according to an innate, callous, self-interested logic. So that's it. I hope those 4 chapters weren't too much for you, because that was certainly a lot of theory there. Come and talk to me. I really would appreciate it if you could.